Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the what and why of documenting your infrastructure, or as I like to call it, how I ended up in way over my head and what I decided to do about it. My name is Kevin Metcalf. I'm an IT supervisor for the Foothill-De Anza Community College District. Been a Linux system administrator for a few decades now. I want to start off by saying you probably won't agree with everything in this talk, and that's perfectly fine. This is about what I did and why I did what I did, not necessarily about why you should do what I did. I'm going to try and leave a lot of time available at the end here so that we can do Q&A or so that folks can make comments and so that we can all learn maybe a little bit more about what I should have done. So what happened here? Well, I'll give you a quick overview. A few years ago, I was working as a project manager after about 20 years as a Linux Unix system administrator. The employer I was working for offered an early retirement incentive, and I was much too young to take them up on that. The primary Linux and Unix system administrator, however, was not. And about 5 days from when he walked out the door into retirement bliss, my supervisor pulled me into the room and said, you used to do this for a living, so we have decided we're going to assign you this list of job duties and responsibilities until such a time as, we can hire a replacement for this position. It's a temporary assignment. And I have since learned that I have a very different idea about what the word temporary means than some other people do in this world, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So what did I get? Well, over the next 5 days, I spent nearly every minute at work tracking down the list of servers, the list of job duties and responsibilities, and all the documentation that I could find on these servers, which turned out to be somewhat more limited than I had anticipated. There was no deployment automation. There was no configuration management. There were 5 sentences of documentation on one of the pages in our documentation management system. So what did I do? Well, once I realized just how deep the water was that I'd been thrown into, I got right to work and assumed this was maybe a joke. Is somebody trolling me? For those of you maybe with a little bit more gray hair, am I on candid camera? After I realized this wasn't a joke, the next step became pretty obvious. I won't tell you exactly what went through my head at this point, but suffice to say, I'm reasonably sure some of you can figure that one out. Now, I did take a few minutes to try and say, hey, this is a lot of new work. Is this something where I can, work overtime, or is there, the possibility of a pay scale adjustment here or anything? And that really wasn't anything my employer was interested in, which led to the next step. And I'm just going to mention this one in passing. A wise friend of mine once told me, if your job makes you cry, perhaps it's time for you to look for a different job. And I have taken that advice in the past, and it has served me well. But in this case, I decided, this really is more of a once-in-a-career challenge, and it's up to me to decide how I'm going to face this, right? And now that I say that, I think about that. I really hope this was just a once-in-a-career challenge. Anyway, So what did I do? Well, here are the steps I went through. And at first, I looked back on what I had done, and I'm like, wow, this was a pretty time-wasting set of things to do. But some of you have probably put the pieces together and realized that there's a pattern developing here. These are the steps that people go through during other parts of life. And I realized that maybe I was being griefed. So eventually I decided I was going to put together a plan, right? I only had a few days to pry whatever I could out of my predecessor, and I decided to really focus on just 3 tasks. The first task, was to get a list of as many servers as possible. The next task, get some login credentials if they exist. And try and find at least one user contact for each system. There's probably other things I should have done, but given the limited amount of time I had, this was the best I could. So let's take a look at each of these. It turns out getting a list of servers was not as difficult as I thought it was going to be. We had a finite number of physical server rooms, and I was given access to our VMware installation. All of the cloud servers were managed by a different team, so I didn't have to worry about getting those pieces. But I basically did a physical walkthrough of all the locations with servers and, grabbed all the data off VMware, and through the process of elimination, I, checked in, are you responsible for this? Is this a Windows Server team machine? I figured out what is the list of machines that I actually need to worry about. After that, I went back to the individual and said, hey, I need to try and find some login credentials here. And I'm not sure what the current industry best practice is for managing login credentials, but I am reasonably confident what I inherited at the time was not that. I will spare you the details, but I eventually was able to collect the whole set. And as a quick aside, whoever it was that invented the single user mode password reset concept, oh, thank you. So what was next? Well, the last step, what was to find at least one user that uses the system, right? So that I could at least figure out what kinds of services it was running. And I tell you all of this to hopefully begin a little bit of a dialogue, right? I'd like you to ask yourself, what should your organization do differently, right? How might what I went through impact someone in your organization? I mean, hopefully you've at least got most of these covered, right? I can't imagine anyone here needs to hear this, but since you've all come to my therapy session, my presentation, thank you. Since you've come to my presentation, I'm going to go ahead and sort of quickly walk through some of these. The first one is have an up-to-date list of servers, right? Now, I know some of you probably work places where everything is serverless, which, as we all know, means that there are no servers anywhere. Anyway, if you do manage to work someplace where they've got some servers lying around, this is probably a good idea, right? And it's not just good device management practice, it's kind of a security imperative, right? It seems like it would be hard to secure things if you're not aware you have them, right? The next thing to think about is, have a plan for managing credentials. And I'm guessing most of you work someplace where this is handled by single sign-on or what have you, but there's almost always a few legacy systems sitting around somewhere that haven't been or can't be tied to your credential management system. I would encourage you to take a look at your list of devices, take a look at what's being managed by that credentialing system, and come up with a plan anywhere you see gaps in there, right? Also, I would encourage folks to check in with your users and see if they even still need this particular tool, right? This one works either for servers or for serverless deployments. For any tool or service you've deployed, I really encourage you to maintain a user contact chain, right? Check in regularly and make sure that this tool is still even needed. And if it's not, prune it. I ended up shutting down over a half a dozen machines that weren't even being used anymore, right? So what happened next? Well, after I had my lists, now I had to figure out how I was going to keep the wheels running and make sure whoever was hired into this role permanently wouldn't come away with the same scars I had. And I want to take a quick aside here to talk to you about something that I'm a firm believer in, and it's this idea that there are two kinds of people in this world. One kind of person says, I suffered through whatever, and so anybody else that wants to do this should also have to suffer through it, right? This builds character. This allowed me to learn things. I wouldn't be who I am today if I hadn't gone through that. The other type of person says, I had to suffer through this thing, and I want to do everything I can to prevent anyone else from having to suffer through that too, right? On the one hand, maybe suffering is how you really learn something. On the other hand, people think, there's a lot of suffering in this world. anything I can do to reduce some of it, that's probably a good thing. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, other than a little bit of introspection about which of these two categories you fit into, I think I'm okay with that. As an old friend of mine who was a chemist used to tell me, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the precipitate. Anyway, so what did I actually do? Well, my first step was to document the duties of the position. It became clear pretty quickly that the initial list of duties I received was what management thought this position was responsible for, not necessarily the actual list of ongoing duties. To figure that out, I ended up going directly to my coworkers. Anyone that worked with the individual in this position, I asked him, hey, can you look through your email sent box for anything you sent to this individual? What kinds of things were you asking for? In what ways was this position a gatekeeper for how you needed to do your job? I could spend the next year figuring out how to actually flesh out that outline and figure out where do the different systems that we've identified fit into this picture? What responsibilities does this position have to each of these various user groups? By putting together a document where somebody could just step into the role and say, oh, here are the list of things I'm responsible for. Here are a list of tasks that I'm going to be asked to do and where I should go to get information about how to accomplish those tasks. Now, most of the job duties I identified fell into a few different categories. The first category I like to think of as infrastructure pieces, right? This is stuff like DNS or email or printing, Internet of Things devices, managing things like that. These are those infrastructure pieces that we have to keep up with in order to make sure that whatever business processes drive parts of the organization, that they have the back end pieces in place to be able to do their development or whatever. The next category were things like security, adding or removing user permissions to things, managing SSL certificates, penetration testing on the different systems that are being deployed out there, managing patches, managing upgrades on servers, maintaining an operating system platform that's uniform, that makes some kind of sense. Another thing they were responsible for was licensing, right? Monitoring and updating, applying license updates, making sure we have sufficient numbers of licenses, making sure we're not overpaying for licenses, things like that. Also project consulting, right? When somebody comes into the role, comes to the person in this role and says, hey, we're working on this project. We need a system that can do X. Oh, sure. Here's the technology you would need to use to solve that particular problem. Things like that. The next step was to really thoroughly document that device inventory, right? I took the information I gathered during the previous phases. I collected a list of servers that I could create that was linked directly into that prior document about what are the duties of this position? What are the roles and responsibilities? By tying in specific pieces, like when you're going to be deploying DNS, you need to go to this machine. You need to run these particular scripts. They are going to impact all of these different servers. By making all of those individual servers linkable, it makes it a lot quicker for somebody to drill down if they run into an error somewhere. So documenting the device inventory was, on the one hand, just creating, pages of documentation for each of the servers that were going to be managed. But on the other hand, also tying that back into all of the other pieces. So the next step here was to go all Ansible on that mess, right? I'm a firm believer in using configuration management when your infrastructure gets beyond a certain size. And frankly, this was as much about making sure I didn't create more problems than I fixed as it was about making life easier for the next employee, right? I could do a whole talk on Ansible, and I know lots of folks have done talks on Ansible and other configuration management tools, especially here at LISA. But let's just touch on a few key points here. Since I was only going to be in this job temporarily, I figured I probably shouldn't redesign everything from the ground up. But things I was concerned about breaking, I did make sure to automate. System services that were customized or not deployed in a standard or obvious manner. Key-based access to systems, both to reduce overhead and gatekeeper for employees, but also to reduce reliance on things like shared passwords. Patch automation, did a lot of automation on patching and figuring out how to make sure that as soon as patches are available, they're able to be applied where it makes sense. Also, identifying locations where this position was a bottleneck for our developers. Are there places where developers need this role to do a certain thing before they can make any progress on their current project, right? Is this role having to be that bottleneck? Can we automate some of that? Those kinds of things. Those are places where I looked at the configuration management and automation and said, okay, these are things that I think should be automated. These are things to make life easier for the developers. And, I could spend a lot of time here, but I do want to leave sufficient time for questions and answers, for comments, for everyone to really have some more time to identify what I should have done differently and make sure that, we make that information available to folks. But I do have a set of takeaways that I just want to put out here where, these are things that I hope people will remember for the presentation. I wanted to try and give everyone at least one thing they could take away. So one thing that you can take to heart. Here's a few things I learned along the way. Hopefully this is going to be helpful to folks. I'm going to start here. Hoarding knowledge is not job security. And I'd like to encourage everyone, just be respectful of whoever comes after you, right? Treat your successor as a human being that shouldn't have to suffer just to learn something or just because you suffered, right? I specifically ask questions about documentation in job interviews when I'm interviewing candidates, right? I know sometimes people think, well, if I thoroughly document my position, enough that somebody could step into this role and do it, what's to stop my employer from just firing me and hiring somebody that they can pay less money to do that? If that's really a legitimate concern for you, I would ask you to question your corporate culture, because that sounds like a real toxic work environment to me. Maybe you don't want to stay there. Maybe one of the best things you can do is to document that position and move on to some place that values your ability to do that kind of work and to reduce the complexity of a position. Here's another important point. It is difficult to secure something you don't know you have, right? I had more than a few sleepless nights where I stayed awake wondering, is my organization going to be owned through a known attack vector or an unknown attack vector? Did I identify all the systems that I needed to identify? Do I know absolutely all the services that are running on these servers? How many things are out there that I don't know about? I would recommend finding a way to reduce those unknown vectors to the greatest extent possible. Another lesson I learned here is don't trash talk your coworkers. Don't trash talk your employer. Don't trash talk your management. Some of you may have noticed this, but I haven't actually said anything unkind about the previous employee that was in the role that I was, placed into. And that's on purpose. Over the course of this experience, I've really discovered just how toxic it is to do that. You don't have to do that to move forward. I wasn't 100% successful at this. I'm human. But my hope is that you can, really take this to heart. It's as true about somebody that's left the organization as it is about folks that are in the organization. In my current role as a supervisor, if someone comes to me and says, hey, I have a real problem with the way so-and-so is doing this job. They're terrible at this job, and let me tell you why. My first instinct as an employer is, this individual is upset with that individual, not there are things we should be doing differently, right? This is a conflict and not a problem. So I would encourage you to really think through the ramifications of trash talking coworkers. In the short term, it might feel good, but in the long run, it's really not going to be doing you any favors either. I would also encourage folks to have that conversation about what needs to be documented, right? Try and figure this out and do it on a regular basis. Now, you don't have to document everything, but please try not to document nothing. A good place to start, if you're trying to have this conversation, if you want to bring up this idea, is what do you wish someone had told you about this job when you first stepped into the role? What do your coworkers wish someone had told them when they stepped into the job, right? I think you'll be surprised if you go around the room and start asking people. Most people are actually going to have a different answer to this question. At least that's what I've observed. So it's a good place to start to have that discussion. Now, try and figure out what are the really important things to document. And finally, I want to leave you with this one. And I really hope this isn't a controversial point. But I really believe documentation is an equity issue, right? Not everyone has the same experiences when they step into a role. Not everyone has had the same opportunities to get to a particular role. If you find yourself in the course of deciding whether to document something or not, saying, someone can just look that, so someone can just ask somebody about that, right? They don't need to be able to look that up. Not every culture is as comfortable asking questions as the culture might be that you came from. People have had all kinds of experiences with all kinds of employers along the way. That may be really hard for somebody stepping into a role, and it may make the difference between someone being successful in a role and not being successful in that role. Are you setting someone up for failure when you could just take a few hours to write something down? I guess the way I would like to leave this discussion is with this idea that access to information is an equity issue. If your employer has a value of equity, take the time to think about these kinds of things. It's not just about hiring. It really is about every step along the way. So on that lighthearted note, that's all I have for this topic. Again, thank you for being a part of my therapy session, my talk. Sorry, thank you for coming to this talk. I'm sure most everybody here would have done at least something differently, or would have identified something that I did that was, a catastrophic problem for the organization going forward. So this is an opportunity for everyone, you feel free to ask me questions about what I did, but also, sort of discuss maybe ways you think it should be done differently, right? My goal is for everyone to come away learning about ways that things can be improved, and if how I did something is an improvement over how you're doing something, great. But maybe somebody out there has a much better idea about it. So if you'd rather chat offline, there's some contact information here for me as well. But thank you for coming to the talk, and let's jump right into Q&A.